Hi, this is Stephen Cook giving a basic introduction to the letter of James. The author, there are four men in the New Testament named James. Scripture citations are here. The Lord's half-brother is the most likely candidate. James was not always a believer according to John 7:5, and perhaps came to accept Jesus as the Christ or the Messiah after his resurrection. Two sections of Scripture bear in on this. One is John 3 through 5, which talks about his brothers. He had sisters as well. But it says, "Therefore his brothers said to him, Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." And here's the verse that reveals this. "For not even his brothers were believing in him." And so at this time when Jesus was beginning his earthly ministry, his family, his brothers at least, did not believe in him as the Messiah. So when did James come to faith, to believe that Jesus is the Christ? The verse that to me seems to stand out is 1 Corinthians 15:7. And picking up in verse 5, it talks about after the resurrection of Christ, after his death, burial, resurrection. It says that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep, there being a euphemism for believers who have died. And then in verse 7 it says, "Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." It could be at this time that James, seeing Jesus in his resurrected body, at that moment came to believe in him as the Christ, the Messiah. So picking up on the continuation of authorship, Paul mentions James as one of the pillars of the church, along with Peter and John in Galatians 2:9. Early church fathers such as Origen, Eusebius, Cyril of Jerusalem, Athanasius, and Augustine believed that James wrote the epistle. And according to church tradition, this is outside of Scripture or in addition to Scripture, we have a tradition that James was beaten to death with clubs near the Jewish temple in AD 62. Tradition also reports that he prayed for his attackers. The date of the letter was perhaps written around AD 45 to 48, and this would make it the earliest epistle in the New Testament, even predating the gospel accounts and the other epistles. His audience, James wrote primarily to Jewish Christians. He calls them brethren in a number of places. And these were Jewish Christians who were scattered outside of Jerusalem into Gentile regions. What brought about the scattering of these Jewish Christians outside of Jerusalem? Well, Acts 8:1 gives us a clear statement that after the message and the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7, in Acts 8:1 it talks about how the church was persecuted, and this would be the Jewish believers in Jerusalem, and how they were scattered. It uses the same word that appears in James 1:1, that is the word that's translated dispersion. So these were persecuted Christians who were scattered outside of Jerusalem. Now, generally, Jews living outside of Jerusalem faced racial discrimination and hostile from the Gentiles. But Jewish Christians faced suffering from both Gentiles as well as from fellow Jews because they were rejected by both. The style of the letter. The Epistle of James conforms to proverbial wisdom literature. If you read through James and you also read through like the Proverbs, you'll find similarity. James writes with very strong language. He's very blunt and to the point. He uses a total of 54 imperatives, that is, commands. He writes to correct improper thinking, speaking, and behavior among Christians. And he uses nearly 30 colorful illustrations from nature. The purpose of the letter. James wrote to exhort, here with 54 imperatives, wrote to exhort Christians to spiritual maturity, which manifests itself in a practical holiness. He urged them to have a belief that behaves, and that probably becomes the best way to describe the theme of James, that he's writing that they might have a belief that behaves, or a salvation that serves. Spiritual immaturity hindered them from dealing with trials, temptation to sin, worldly respect in the church, sins of the tongue, love for the world, and hoarding wealth. Now, Paul wrote about saving faith that is visible to God, whereas James wrote about a serving faith that is visible to others. And we'll deal with many of these subjects as we work through the letter of James verse by verse. But a basic introduction gives us an overview of the author, the audience, the date, and the purpose of the writing. So we will move on from here and begin our exposition of the letter of James.